Vikings weren't just warriors, they were forged in the freeze, hardened by one of the most brutal climates on Earth, and their homes, just as unbreakable. These weren't cozy cabins. Viking longhouses were war-ready shelters, engineered to face howling winds, crushing snow, and cold that could snap bones. No blueprints, no power tools, not even nails. Yet some of these wooden beasts outlasted stone castles from the same era. The wildest part, they built them fast. A crew with axes and nothing but ancestral memory could raise one in a matter of weeks. So how did a primitive people pull off what modern builders struggle to match? When modern builders begin construction, they typically start with detailed plans, permits, and pouring concrete foundations. Vikings began with something far more valuable: generations of environmental knowledge. Site selection wasn't random, it was strategic genius. Vikings would spend days observing how water drained after rainfall, where snow accumulated during winter, and most importantly, how wind patterns affected different locations. They knew that choosing the wrong spot could mean the difference between a longhouse lasting 5 years or 50. Contrary to what many might assume, Vikings rarely built on completely flat ground. They actually preferred slight slopes with particular orientations to the sun. A longhouse built with its long axis, positioned east-west, would capture maximum solar heat during winter months while minimizing wind exposure during storms. This passive solar orientation reduced heating needs by up to 30% compared to randomly oriented structures, a technique rediscovered by green architects only in the 1970s. Once the perfect site was secured, Vikings established a foundation system that would make modern engineers rethink their reliance on concrete. Rather than digging deep foundations susceptible to frost heave in freezing climates, they created a floating foundation. Large support posts, averaging 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter, were set on flat stones rather than buried directly in the ground. This seemingly simple approach had profound advantages. It prevented moisture wicking from soil into wooden posts, allowed for seasonal ground movement without structural damage, and made repairs remarkably straightforward. The structural frame itself used what we now call post and beam construction, a system so effective it's still used in high-end homes today. Support posts would be erected at regular intervals, typically 1.5 to 2 meters apart, connected by horizontal beams that distributed weight evenly. What's particularly impressive is how these elements were joined. Instead of relying solely on nails, which were precious resources, Vikings used sophisticated joinery techniques including mortise and tenon connections, lap joints, and wooden pegs. Measurements weren't random either. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable consistency in proportions across buildings throughout Scandinavia, suggesting standardized building practices that predated modern construction codes by a millennium. The typical longhouse maintained a width-to-height ratio of approximately 1 to 0.8, a proportion that maximized interior space, while ensuring structural stability during high winds. And it wouldn't take long for the framework to rise. A team of 5 to 7 experienced builders could erect the main structural elements of a medium-sized longhouse, approximately 15 to 20 meters in length, in just 3 to 5 days. The efficiency came from pre-cutting and preparing major components before assembly began, essentially creating the world's first prefabricated building system. What truly set Viking construction apart, however, was its brilliant flexibility. The curved walls characteristic of many longhouses weren't just aesthetic choices. They created a structure that could flex slightly during storms, rather than rigidly resisting force until breaking. This dynamic structural response allowed Viking longhouses to withstand wind forces that would damage more rigid buildings, much like how modern skyscrapers are designed to sway during earthquakes. With this foundation and framework established, the stage was set for the next phase, transforming raw materials into building components that could stand against the harsh Nordic elements. If you've ever played with building blocks as a child, you understand the fundamental truth that your creation is only as good as its components. Vikings took this principle to an almost obsessive level. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings didn't simply chop down the nearest trees and start building. Material gathering followed strict seasonal timing that maximized quality while minimizing effort. Oak and pine, the primary structural woods, were harvested in winter when their sap content was lowest, dramatically reducing later warping and insect infestation. This single practice extended the lifespan of wooden components by 15 to 20 years compared to summer-cut timber. The ingenuity escalated once trees were felled. Logs destined for critical structural elements were submerged in salt water for 1 to 3 months, a natural preservation technique that impregnated the wood with salt and significantly enhanced rot resistance. Archaeological finds show that properly salt-treated posts could last up to 30 years in direct ground contact, compared to just 5 to 7 years for untreated wood. Beyond the main structure lies an even more fascinating story of material innovation. Vikings didn't just build with whatever was at hand, they strategically sourced specific materials for specific functions. For walls, a combination of split planks, wattle, and daub, a mixture of clay, sand, animal dung, and straw, created surprisingly effective insulation. Modern testing of reconstructed sections shows these walls achieved an insulation value roughly equivalent to a modern wall, with 3 inches of fiberglass insulation. Quite remarkable for primitive technology. Roofing materials demonstrated similar sophistication. The outer layer typically used overlapping wooden shingles or sheets of birch bark topped with sod. This wasn't just about keeping rain out. The living sod layer continued to grow, creating a self-healing membrane that could last decades with minimal maintenance. The weight of these living roofs, approximately 160 to 200 kilograms per square meter, also compressed wall materials, naturally increasing their insulation value while helping stabilize the entire structure. What set Viking builders apart was their deep understanding of wood. They knew different trees behaved differently. Birch flexed, oak held firm, and they used each where it made the most sense. A single longhouse needed up to 70 mature trees, so waste wasn't an option. Through precise splitting instead of sawing, they squeezed up to 30% more out of every trunk, turning one oak into posts, planks, and furniture. Material prep could take months, but by the time construction began, they had a custom-fit kit designed by nature and sharpened by generations of experience. Imagine building a 25-meter structure without a single measuring tape, level, or power saw. Seems impossible, doesn't it? Yet Vikings did exactly this. Using construction techniques so clever, they compensated for the lack of modern tools, while sometimes achieving greater precision. The construction process began with setting the main support posts on their stone footings. Rather than relying on measuring tools, Viking builders used ropes with knots tied at specific intervals, an ancient form of measuring tape that could be easily reproduced or replaced. Archaeological evidence suggests these rope measures were standardized within communities, allowing for remarkable consistency. Post holes at excavated longhouse sites typically vary by less than 5 centimeters across dozens of meters, precision that would challenge even modern builders. With the main posts positioned, the real craftsmanship emerged. Horizontal beams were notched to fit precisely onto the posts using a technique called scarf jointing. And because nails were too valuable to use extensively, these joints had to be self-securing through precise woodworking. Using axes sharpened to almost surgical precision, Viking craftsmen could create joints with gaps smaller than 2 millimeters, tight enough to prevent water penetration and structural movement. Regional adaptations appear clearly in wall construction methods. In coastal Norway, walls typically consisted of vertical planks slotted into grooved base beams, while Danish longhouses often featured the wattle and daub approach mentioned earlier. These weren't just aesthetic differences, they reflected adaptations to local climate conditions and available materials. the roof presented the ultimate challenge. Supporting the immense weight of wooden shingles and sod, up to 30 tons for a medium-sized longhouse, required both engineering know-how and cooperative muscle power. The roof structure typically used paired rafters meeting at the center ridgepole, creating triangular support systems every 1.5 to 2 meters along the building's length. These weren't simply lashed together. They were joined using complex notching that distributed weight evenly while locking components together. In a brilliant rejection of perfectionism, Vikings understood that absolute symmetry, while aesthetically pleasing, wasn't always structurally necessary. Roof pitches typically ranged from 45 to 53 degrees, steep enough to shed snow effectively, but not so steep as to catch the full force of winter gales. This range allowed builders to adjust based on local weather patterns, creating steeper roofs in higher snowfall regions. And surprisingly, all of this took little time. Once materials were prepared, a community working together could complete a medium-sized longhouse in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. This speed came from highly specialized task allocation, with experienced craftsmen handling critical joints while less skilled workers prepared thatch bundles or mixed daub. The finishing touches revealed an unexpected artistic flair. Interior walls were lined with a clay mixture of fine sand and sometimes animal blood, acting as a natural binder similar to modern latex additives. This was applied in thin layers, partially dried, and burnished with stones to create a hard, waterproof surface that reflected firelight throughout the interior. What emerged wasn't just shelter, but a finely tuned system managing temperature, moisture, and air quality. Despite being labeled as barbarians, Vikings used design principles scientifically validated only in the last century. The real question isn't how they built such effective structures, but why we abandoned these proven methods for more resource-intensive modern ones. Step inside a reconstructed Viking longhouse today, and your first impression might be of darkness and simplicity. You'd be missing the point entirely. The interior layout of a Viking longhouse wasn't just arranged, it was choreographed to support daily life in extraordinarily challenging conditions. The typical longhouse interior followed a linear organization with a central hearth, or series of hearths, running down the middle of the structure. This wasn't merely a cooking arrangement, it was the core of an integrated heating and ventilation system that predated modern HVACs by a millennium. Far from merely huddling around the fire to stay warm, they arranged hearths, sleeping platforms, and work areas to create a sophisticated airflow pattern that distributed heat and managed smoke. Sleeping platforms were typically elevated 40 to 60 centimeters above the floor level, placing occupants in the warmest air zone while smoke naturally rose toward vented areas in the roof. This air stratification strategy is identical to principles used in high-efficiency passive solar homes today. The sleeping arrangements themselves reveal the ingenious practicality of Viking design. Beds were typically positioned along the long walls, furthest from doors but closest to the structural walls where draft risk was highest. This placement served multiple functions. It created a thermal buffer zone between sleepers and the exterior, utilized body heat to warm the walls from the inside, and maximized the usable central space during daylight hours. Light management transformed these seemingly dark interiors into functional spaces. Small openings at strategic points, not large enough to create significant heat loss, allowed daylight to enter, while smoke holes in the roof provided additional illumination. The positioning of these openings wasn't random. Archaeological evidence shows they were often arranged to highlight specific work areas at different times of day as the sun moved across the sky. At night, the Vikings employed a lighting system that was remarkably efficient for its time. Rather than using precious beeswax candles, they developed lamps that burned fish oil or animal fat in soapstone containers. These lamps produced less smoke than torches, while providing sustainable illumination for extended periods. The strategic placement of polished metal or light-colored materials behind these light sources served as crude reflectors, amplifying available light. The Longhouse interior reveals a deep understanding of community flow and efficiency. Spaces transitioned from public to private. Entry zones acted as airlocks. Central hearth areas served for communal work and dining. And private sleeping quarters sat at the ends for quiet and separation. Workspaces were strategically placed for natural light, supporting tasks like food prep and textiles. What stands out is how multifunctional everything was. Storage was built into the structure. Sleeping platforms became daytime seating. Even support posts carried symbolic carvings while reinforcing the frame. In a 15 to 20 meter space, up to 30 people lived, worked, and socialized using just a third of the resources modern homes require, thanks to ingenious design, not overcrowding. To modernize, it might seem basic, but Viking longhouses were masterfully engineered survival hubs, tailored to thrive in brutal environments. But even the most intelligently designed interior would be meaningless without effective protection from the Nordic elements, a challenge Vikings met with astonishing effectiveness. A typical winter storm in coastal Norway can deliver wind speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and snowfall that would paralyze a modern city. For the Vikings, weathering such conditions wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Their solution? Turn the structure itself into a shield. The weatherproofing systems in Viking longhouses began with the roof. Unlike modern roofs designed primarily to shed water, Viking roofs had to manage a complex mix of challenges: heavy snow loads, driving rain, howling winds, and temperature differentials that would cause less thoughtful structures to crack and fail. The solution was multi-layered brilliance. Beneath the visible sod layer lay carefully overlapped birch bark sheets, nature's perfect waterproofing membrane. Birch bark contains naturally water-resistant resins that, when properly layered, create an almost impermeable barrier. Testing on reconstructed roofs has shown that properly installed birch bark layers can remain watertight for 30+ years with minimal maintenance. During heavy rains, water would simply channel down the bark layers to the roof edge, while the insulating properties of the sod layer above prevented rapid temperature fluctuations that could crack or damage the waterproofing system. But it's the wind management aspects that truly showcase Viking engineering intelligence. The aerodynamic profile of longhouses, with their low eaves and carefully calculated roof pitch, created a structure that essentially deflected wind rather than fighting it head-on. Snow patterns around excavated longhouse sites suggest that these buildings created their own microclimate, with snowdrifts forming in predictable patterns that actually provided additional insulation during the coldest months. Insulation strategies varied regionally, but followed consistent principles. In coastal areas with milder but wetter conditions, walls packed with seaweed provided excellent thermal resistance while naturally repelling insects due to the salt content. The most vulnerable points in any structure are its openings, and Viking solutions were remarkably effective. Doorways featured multiple ingenious details, slightly raised thresholds to prevent water ingress, sophisticated wooden door constructions with overlapping planks to minimize drafts, and, in many cases, angled entry passages that created natural airlocks. These entry passages served multiple functions. They reduced direct wind penetration, created transition zones between outdoor and indoor temperatures, and provided storage space for outdoor equipment. Smoke management reveals another dimension of Viking practical genius. Rather than simply cutting holes in the roof, which would create problematic rain entry points, they developed controllable vent systems. Wooden panels that could be adjusted using poles allowed occupants to fine-tune airflow based on wind direction and interior conditions. In some reconstructed longhouses, these systems have demonstrated the ability to clear smoke while minimizing heat loss with surprising efficiency. During the darkest winter months, when temperatures remained below freezing for weeks on end, Vikings employed additional survival strategies within the longhouse design. Archaeological evidence suggests they sometimes brought livestock into sectioned-off portions of the structure during extreme weather, not just to protect valuable animals, but because the body heat from cattle and sheep contributed significantly to overall warmth. A single cow produces approximately the same heat as a 1 kilowatt electric heater, making a small herd a substantial heat source in desperate conditions. Water management extended beyond simply keeping rain out. Drainage channels excavated around longhouse foundations directed snowmelt and rainwater away from the structure, while gravel layers beneath floor surfaces prevented ground moisture from rising into the living space. These measures didn't just protect the building materials, they created healthier interior conditions by reducing humidity and preventing mold growth. The comprehensive approach to weatherproofing wasn't just effective, it was life-saving. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that during the harshest recorded winter events, communities with well-constructed longhouses survived with remarkably low casualty rates compared to other pre-modern cultures facing similar climate extremes. What emerges from this examination isn't just a picture of clever building techniques, but a holistic survival strategy encoded in architectural form. The Viking longhouse represents one of history's most successful adaptations to extreme environmental challenges, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of generational knowledge accumulation. Speaking of which, their ingenuity wasn't limited to architecture. Wait until you see the 10 most brutal Viking weapons you've probably never heard of.